Homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks, my name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. Today we are going to do some canning, and we are going to make an eggplant puttanesca sauce. And this is an unusual recipe in a couple of ways. One is it's very unusual to find any recipes that call for eggplant. It's not one of those things that's normally canned, and it's one of those things that is not generally approved for canning alone, so you can't just can a bunch of eggplant and put it in a jar. But there are some recipes out there that include eggplant, and this is one of them. So puttanesca is a pasta sauce that traditionally has onions, tomatoes, garlic, olives, capers, and then in this particular recipe, it also has sweet peppers, which is not traditional, but it's a nice addition, particularly when the whole point of this is to use up a lot of lovely garden produce. And the recipe is roasted. And so we roast all of the tomatoes, and then we roast the eggplant and the onions and the peppers. It's meant to be chunky. It's meant to be fairly good sized chunks on a pasta rather than a nice smooth sauce. And so you leave everything pretty chunky, cook it down with a bunch of red wine and some balsamic vinegar. The vinegar in this is important because this recipe is a water bath canned recipe. And it's unusual because it has the eggplant and all the other vegetables in it, which means that the pH is going to have risen a bunch because of that. And so normally those kind of recipes are pressure canned rather than water bath canned, but with the addition of the wine and the addition of the balsamic vinegar, it's going to bring that pH back low enough that we can water bath can this instead of pressure canning it. And so this is a delightful recipe. It's a lovely recipe for just eating on a weeknight that's a little bit more complex than your basic marinara sauce. But it also occurred to me just recently that it would be really good as a bruschetta topping, basically any good crusty toasted bread. And then on that, you normally would put tomatoes and some Parmesan cheese and some garlic and that kind of thing. But I thought this would be a really lovely bruschetta topping. And so I'm going to give this a try right now. That is quite delightful. And so another addition to this recipe is you could easily do this as an appetizer where you just topped, toasted crostinis with this and added a little bit of cheese and broiled them. So really nice, quick appetizer that is from your home fresh garden produce. Lovely. So eggplant puttanesca, a wonderful full summer eggplant recipe. Let's get started. All right, we're going to start out by roasting 6 pounds of tomatoes. The recipe calls for plum tomatoes. I'm using heirloom tomatoes just because that's what I have, and I use heirloom tomatoes all the time in recipes that call for plum tomatoes. It just means it's going to have a little bit more moisture in it. That's not going to hurt anything. And then some of these tops and bottoms you see here, I dry heirloom tomatoes for sale. And when I'm slicing them to dry, the tops and the bottoms often have holes in them, so those were just left over. But 6 pounds of those going into a 400-degree oven for 45 minutes. And those are done. They should have a little bit of char on them, and the skin should be nice and easy to remove. For some reason, this pineapple heirloom tomato was really hard to peel, but everything else in here came off very easily. I could just pull it off with my fingers. I love recipes that start with roasted tomatoes. It's just so much easier. And then I'm going to put all of those into a big holding bowl because I need these baking sheets for the next part of the vegetables that I'm going to bake. And I'm going to save every drip of that beautiful tomato juice because it's somewhat caramelized, and that's tons and tons of flavor. And these are lined with heavy-duty tin foil. You can use parchment paper, but my parchment paper doesn't come up the sides of the cookie sheet, and so I end up with a lot of moisture underneath them that ends up browning. Yes, that was an earwig that just ran away there because they're everywhere this time of year. I'm chunking up 2 pounds of eggplant into 1/2 inch to 1 inch chunks. The big one is an Italian variety called Rosa Bianca, and then this little guy is a Japanese variety called Littlefinger, and so on that one I just sliced it across because it was about 1 inch in diameter already. Those are going onto a cookie sheet. and trying to arrange them flat so that they get some browning on a flat side. And then I need 3 onions chunked up into quarters. These are onions out of my garden, so I'm using a mix here of red onions and yellow onions. Onions are interchangeable in canning recipes, so use what you've got. This is a cipollini where the bottom blew out from too much moisture, and so there took a little bit of trimming. And then it calls for 3 red peppers. It doesn't indicate red bell peppers. I'm assuming that's what they meant. These are called Carmen, and they are a bullhorn style variety, very sweet. About a pound, and so I just measured out a pound of the Carmen peppers, and those are going back into the oven and roasting again. Once those are done and out of the oven, we're going to let that cool off, and then we're going to pulse our onions and peppers in the food processor to give everything a good chop. And this is why I own a food processor, is days like this. You can hand chop this, but this definitely saves you a ton of time. And then everything goes into a large pot. This is I think a 5-quart Dutch oven, and it just barely fits. So you do need a good-sized pot in order to do this, but this has got our tomatoes, our eggplants, and now our peppers and onions. And then we're going to add in the rest of our ingredients. This is a 1.5 cups of chopped kalamata olives, 3 ounces or so of capers. I probably went a little light on this. I'm not a huge caper person, but it is traditional to put capers in puttanesca. 2 cups of red wine. This was a cab sauv that we happen to have on hand. And then a 1/2 cup of balsamic vinegar. 2 teaspoons of salt. 2 teaspoons of dried oregano. A teaspoon of black pepper, and then a tablespoon of chopped anchovies or anchovy paste. You're not going to taste this. It's not going to taste fishy, but it is going to add a big dose of umami. And then those are frozen roasted garlic bombs. It calls for 6 cloves of garlic. I decided to just use those roasted garlics instead. Bring that mixture to a full boil and cook for about 15 minutes. And then we're going to put these into our pint jars. And as I've mentioned in other canning videos, I like to go through and fill my jars most of the way full, just so I get an idea of how many I'm going to need and where I'm coming out on the recipe, because I almost always end up with more than what the recipe says I'm going to have. And then I go back in and top them off and finish off the recipe. This made a total of 8 pints for me. And you can see how chunky this is. Not a ton of liquid in this recipe, and that is the way it is supposed to be. It would be even less liquid if I had used plum tomatoes. So this is not meant to be a super runny recipe. And then after I'd done 7, which is what the recipe said it was going to make, I had enough to fill 1 more pint. I don't know what it is about ball recipes. They almost always make more than they say they're going to. And then I'm going back through, evening everything out, making sure everything is packed down. I'm not too worried about air bubbles here because everything is in fairly small pieces, and so air is generally going to escape. And then I'm checking for my 1/2-inch headspace here with my handy-dandy little headspace tool. And this is what we had left, and I ended up just eating this on toast just to confirm that it was a very nice bruschetta topping. So here's all of our jars. Wiping the rims. And there's no oil in this recipe. You're not roasting with oil, and so things are pretty clean. Not too worried about something being on the rim, but give everything a good wipe down as always. And then new canning lids. And then rings should be finger tight, which means just until you start to feel it catch. And then I'm using my pressure canning pot. I am not pressure canning this. I'm just using it as a big pot. So we're going to put everything in there, bring it up to a full rolling boil, and then start our timer. Processing time on this is 45 minutes, so a pretty good long time. And then once that's turned off, I like to let it sit for 5 minutes or so before I take my jars out of the canner. You can see I had a little bit of siphoning. Notice the color of that water there. That's an indication that things got pretty hot and I lost a little bit of liquid to siphoning. And that's another reason to let this sit for 5 minutes once the heat's off before you pull the jars out. But everything did seal. So here's right out of the canner where the lids are just starting to pop. And then here's the next morning. So everything is cooled off. I've got everything labeled, and you can see nice and chunky. And I like to always pick up my jars by the lid just to make sure that the seal is really good. So there you go, guys. Puttanesca, just delicious. I'm really looking forward to having this for appetizers and for quick dinners on weeknights. Thanks for watching, Tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.